I want to begin tonight by asking you a very simple but powerful question. What happens when the empire that has dominated world politics for over 70 years suddenly finds itself on the defensive? That's not just an academic curiosity, it is the reality we are witnessing today. The defeat of Trump's aggressive maneuvering in Venezuela is not merely a story about one man, nor even just about one country in Latin America. It is a symptom, a sign of something much larger: America's declining ability to impose its will abroad. The story of Trump's Venezuela gamble is one of hubris, miscalculation, and an empire confronting the reality of its own declining influence. For decades, Washington assumed Latin America was firmly under its control, a region where U.S. power could be exercised with little pushback. That assumption became the foundation for one of Trump's most aggressive foreign policy moves, the attempt to delegitimize and ultimately overthrow Venezuela's government through sanctions, political isolation, and direct pressure. Yet the end result was not the triumphant image Trump promised his supporters, but rather a humiliating setback that raised troubling questions about the future of U.S. dominance. The clash in Venezuela was supposed to be a show of strength, but instead it revealed weakness. And weakness in foreign policy, when displayed by a superpower, has ripple effects far beyond one country's borders. What makes this episode so important is not just that Washington failed, but that it failed in its own neighborhood. Historically, the United States has treated Latin America as its backyard, a place where its influence was uncontested. The Monroe Doctrine, dating back to the 19th century, made clear that no outside power would be allowed to challenge U.S. control over the region. Yet in the 21st century, Trump's high-profile gamble in Venezuela fell apart, showing that even in the very hemisphere the U.S. once dominated, its grip is slipping. That fact alone is a powerful symbol of decline. Empires do not collapse in a single moment, they unravel piece by piece, often beginning with failures on the edges of their influence. Venezuela was not supposed to be one of those failures, and yet it became exactly that. Consider the strategy itself. Trump's administration sought to isolate Venezuela internationally, build up opposition forces domestically, and pressure the country economically through crushing sanctions. The expectation in Washington was that the combination of economic hardship and political instability would quickly erode popular support for the government. This was, in Trump's calculation, an easy win, a way to project power, showcase America first on the global stage, and reassure his political base that he was restoring American strength. But what actually happened? The Venezuelan government survived. Opposition movements proved fractured and unable to seize control. International support for U.S. intervention was far weaker than expected, with Russia, China, and even regional neighbors resisting the idea of direct U.S. domination. Here's the hook. The empire that could once orchestrate coups with a flick of its wrist now found itself stuck, watching as its threats and sanctions failed to deliver results. That is not just a policy failure, it is a humiliation, and humiliation has consequences. Other nations watched closely. They saw that Washington could no longer guarantee success, even in Latin America, the region most historically under its thumb. And when the world sees a superpower fail, it begins to recalculate its own positions. Allies start to wonder if U.S. promises of protection still hold weight. Rivals see opportunities to expand their influence. For Trump personally, this defeat cut at the core of his political narrative. He had promised to restore American strength, to end the supposed era of weakness. Instead, Venezuela became a glaring example of the very decline he claimed to be reversing. His administration threw its weight into the confrontation, and yet the result was stalemate and embarrassment. It was not only a personal blow, but also a blow to the credibility of U.S. foreign policy. For decades, even when unpopular, U.S. actions in Latin America were effective. Now, the world was watching the United States fail at a task that once would have seemed routine. The larger danger is that such failures do not remain isolated. They set precedents, they embolden resistance. They open doors for rival powers to step in and fill the vacuum. Venezuela's endurance in the face of U.S. pressure sends a message to the global stage. The United States no longer commands the uncontested authority it once did. That message, repeated in different corners of the world, becomes part of a pattern. And that pattern tells us something deeply unsettling about the trajectory of American power. The defeat of Trump's push in Venezuela cannot be viewed as an isolated stumble. It is part of a larger mosaic that reveals the shifting contours of global power. America's inability to secure a decisive outcome in Venezuela mirrors failures and frustrations that have played out across multiple regions. From the withdrawal from Afghanistan, to the stalemates in the Middle East, to waning influence in parts of Africa. Taken together, these setbacks highlight a reality that U.S. leaders have been reluctant to admit. The age of uncontested American dominance is drawing to a close. And here is the hook that should make us pause. When an empire begins losing its ability to shape outcomes abroad, it is not only geopolitics that change, but the very stability of the world order it once created. For decades, the United States could project military, economic, and diplomatic power in ways that left little doubt about the outcome. Wars might be messy, occupations might be unpopular, but the assumption was that Washington would eventually impose its will. That assumption no longer holds. Afghanistan is the most glaring example. 20 years of war, trillions of dollars spent, and yet the U.S. left in 2021 in scenes of chaos, helicopters evacuating personnel from Kabul, in an image eerily reminiscent of the fall of Saigon. That withdrawal was not simply a military retreat, it was a signal to the world that even the mightiest power could be defeated by persistence, resilience, and shifting alliances. The same echoes reverberate through the Venezuelan case. Despite sanctions and intense pressure, the government held firm. It did not matter that Washington declared its intentions. What mattered was that it could not enforce them. The Middle East tells a similar story. U.S. interventions in Iraq and Syria revealed the costs of military overreach and the limits of American influence in a region increasingly shaped by rival powers. Russia's re-entry into the Middle East through Syria and China's growing economic presence across the region highlight a world in which the United States is no longer the uncontested referee. Each defeat, each failed maneuver, chips away at the aura of inevitability that once surrounded American power. The aura of inevitability, after all, is what allows empires to exert control without firing a shot. When smaller nations stop believing in it, they become willing to resist, to challenge, to seek other patrons. That is exactly what we are seeing unfold. The hook here is that the erosion of dominance is not only external but also internal. Each failure abroad feeds a crisis of confidence at home. The American public, wary of forever wars and skeptical of foreign entanglements, begins to question the costs of empire. Leaders, desperate to avoid looking weak, oscillate between retreat and reckless displays of force. This is a dangerous cycle. A declining empire, unsure of itself, can be more unpredictable than a confident one. Venezuela is just one battleground in this larger narrative, but it reflects the same dynamic. The failure to achieve victory did not simply bruise Trump's ego. It underlined for the world that America's power is not what it used to be. What makes this shift so striking is how quickly it has unfolded. Barely 3 decades ago, in the aftermath of the Cold War, the United States stood as the unchallenged superpower, the so-called indispensable nation. Today, that status looks far less secure. Emerging powers like China are offering alternatives to U.S. economic and political influence. Russia, despite its own weaknesses, has learned to exploit American missteps to expand its reach. Even smaller nations, emboldened by the failures of Washington's campaigns, are increasingly willing to carve their own paths. When the world sees Afghanistan, Iraq, and now Venezuela, it sees cracks in the American shield, and it acts accordingly. This is why Trump's defeat in Venezuela resonates far beyond Caracas. It is not about ideology or leadership in one Latin American country. It is about the credibility of U.S. power itself. Once that credibility erodes, it does not return easily. Allies grow nervous, adversaries grow bolder, and the delicate balance of global politics begins to tilt. The lesson here is clear. Venezuela's survival under U.S. pressure is not a local story, it is a global signal. The superpower once feared for its reach can now be resisted, and when resistance spreads, history shows us that empires rarely find an easy way back. For much of modern history, the United States treated Latin America as its uncontested domain, a region where its word carried the weight of law. From interventions in the early 20th century to Cold War-era coups, Washington operated on the assumption that Latin America would bend to its will. Venezuela, Cuba, Chile, Nicaragua, the list of countries where U.S. influence shaped governments is long and undeniable. The concept of the backyard was not just rhetoric, it was the foundation of American hemispheric policy. Yet today, that very backyard no longer obeys. The defeat of U.S. efforts in Venezuela reveals a deeper transformation. Latin America is no longer a passive arena of U.S. power, but an increasingly independent, pluralistic region capable of resisting Washington's dictates. The hook here is simple but startling. When a superpower loses control of its own neighborhood, the decline is no longer a distant possibility, it becomes a present reality. The attempt to topple Venezuela's leadership was supposed to remind Latin America of U.S. supremacy. Instead, it demonstrated the opposite. Despite the deployment of sanctions, economic blockades, and relentless diplomatic pressure, Venezuela remains standing. Even more striking, many Latin American nations refused to fall in line with Washington's agenda. Some quietly distanced themselves, while others openly resisted, preferring regional solutions or alternative partnerships. That divergence alone marks a turning point. Once upon a time, Washington could assemble a coalition in its hemisphere with little effort. Today, it cannot guarantee support, even from its closest neighbors. This is not just a tactical problem, it is a symbolic rupture, the kind of crack in imperial control that history tells us is rarely repaired. Consider the larger forces at work. Latin America has, over the past 2 decades, experienced waves of political shifts that reflect growing skepticism toward U.S. dominance. Movements on the left and center-left have emphasized sovereignty, regional cooperation, and economic ties with emerging powers like China. Infrastructure projects funded by Beijing, military equipment purchased from Moscow, and trade agreements that bypass Washington altogether all point toward a future where U.S. leverage is diluted. Venezuela's defiance fits neatly into this pattern. It is not simply one country standing alone, but part of a wider trend of Latin America asserting autonomy. The United States, accustomed to obedience, now faces a region that weighs its options and chooses its own path. Here's the hook that drives the point home. The Monroe Doctrine, once a statement of absolute U.S. authority over the hemisphere, now reads more like a relic of the past. When nations in Latin America look north, they no longer see an unchallengeable power, but a declining one, distracted by internal division and foreign failures. And when they look across the Pacific or eastward across the Atlantic, they see opportunities in new alliances that promise investment, respect, and alternatives. In that environment, U.S. threats carry less intimidation, and U.S. promises carry less appeal. The result is not just one failed intervention, but a structural weakening of America's entire position in the region. The symbolism of losing control over one's backyard cannot be overstated. Imagine a household where the head once ruled without question, only to discover that family members now make decisions independently, consult outsiders, and refuse orders. That is the metaphorical reality facing the United States in Latin America. Venezuela is the flashpoint, but the story is bigger. A hemisphere once dominated, now slipping from Washington's grasp. And as any student of history knows, when the periphery resists, the center weakens. The failure in Venezuela also sends a message beyond the hemisphere. Rivals like China and Russia recognize the opening and step in to expand their presence. For them, Washington's inability to enforce its will is an opportunity to embed themselves deeper in Latin America through loans, energy partnerships, and military cooperation. For allies of the United States, meanwhile, it raises uncomfortable questions. If Washington cannot even secure outcomes in its closest sphere of influence, how reliable can it be in more distant regions? That quiet doubt can, over time, reshape alliances and strategies across the globe. The deeper danger for the United States is that Latin America's defiance may not be temporary. Once nations discover they can resist successfully, the fear that once kept them compliant begins to fade. Venezuela's survival, despite immense pressure, becomes an example to others. The message is clear: the giant can be defied, and the cost of defiance may be bearable. That realization spreads like wildfire, and once it spreads, the old order cannot simply be restored by force. It requires a fundamental shift in strategy, something Washington has so far been unwilling to contemplate. Trump entered office with a promise that resonated deeply with his supporters. America would no longer be humiliated abroad, no longer made to look weak, no longer second to anyone. America First was marketed as a strategy of dominance, a return to glory, a restoration of the old order where Washington dictated and others obeyed. The clash in Venezuela was supposed to be one of the shining examples of this approach. Here was a government painted as illegitimate, vulnerable to sanctions, and surrounded by regional skepticism. To Trump and his circle, it looked like low-hanging fruit, a chance to demonstrate that American power could still reshape the world. Yet the outcome was the opposite. Instead of victory, the United States was forced to watch as its chosen path collapsed into stalemate. Instead of demonstrating dominance, the campaign highlighted weakness. And here lies the paradoxical hook: the slogan, America First, became in Venezuela a case study of America defeated. The symbolism of this reversal is powerful. Foreign policy, especially for a global superpower, is not just about outcomes on the ground. It is about perception. Power depends not only on what you can do, but on what others believe you can do. For decades, nations across the globe acted as if U.S. influence was inevitable, whether they liked it or not. Trump promised to reinforce that perception, but Venezuela chipped away at it, showing that the United States could invest political capital, apply sanctions, and marshal international rhetoric, and still fail to secure its desired outcome. That failure reverberated loudly because it was not hidden. It was televised, debated, and scrutinized across the world. The message was unavoidable: if the United States cannot impose its will here, perhaps it cannot impose it anywhere. Domestically, the consequences were just as severe. Trump thrived on projecting an image of strength, of being the dealmaker who could bend others to his will. Venezuela revealed the opposite: a leader who overpromised, underestimated the opposition, and misread the shifting dynamics of global politics. For his critics, this was evidence that the rhetoric of America First was hollow. For his supporters, it was a sobering reminder that slogans cannot substitute for strategy. The clash in Venezuela was not a moment of restored glory, it was a moment of exposure, where the myth of regained dominance collided with the reality of geopolitical limits. Here is the deeper hook that should trouble us all: defeats like Venezuela do not stay confined to foreign policy. They shape the global perception of America itself. Rivals watch closely, testing boundaries, probing weaknesses. Allies, once confident in U.S. leadership, begin to hedge their bets, building relationships with other powers in case Washington can no longer deliver. The credibility of a superpower is like a currency. Once it is devalued, it is hard to rebuild. Trump's Venezuela gamble cost the United States credibility not only in Latin America, but across the international stage. The promise of strength turned into the reality of fragility. The irony is painful. America First was meant to protect U.S. interests by reasserting power, yet in practice it exposed vulnerability. By overreaching and underestimating the resistance, the Trump administration revealed that the old model of U.S. dominance no longer works. The sanctions designed to cripple Venezuela became a symbol of Washington's impotence when they failed to produce regime change. The diplomatic isolation campaign revealed not a united front but cracks in U.S. influence. In trying to show that America was still the unrivaled power, Trump ended up showcasing its decline. What makes this particularly dangerous is the pattern it sets. Leaders who fear the appearance of weakness are often tempted to double down, to escalate, to prove their strength in more reckless ways. History is filled with examples of empires that, facing decline, lashed out with increasing desperation. The Venezuelan defeat, framed against Trump's rhetoric of dominance, fits that historical script. The world now sees that America First is not a guarantee of power but a slogan masking limits. And when limits are exposed, the entire architecture of global influence begins to shift. History has a brutal consistency. When it comes to great powers in decline, they rarely go quietly. When an empire begins to lose its grip, when defeats and humiliations accumulate, the instinct is not calm reflection but reckless escalation. That is the danger we see unfolding in the wake of Trump's defeat in Venezuela. The failure to topple a government that Washington openly targeted does not simply register as another foreign policy misstep. It strikes at the very heart of America's self-image as a global enforcer. And here is the unsettling hook: when a superpower confronts its limits, it often becomes most dangerous, not because it is strong, but because it cannot accept weakness. The U.S. response to failure has long followed a familiar pattern. When sanctions don't work, threats of military intervention surface. When diplomacy falters, covert operations take their place. The cycle is one of doubling down, of throwing more weight behind policies that are already collapsing, in the hope that sheer persistence will reverse decline. Venezuela illustrates this perfectly. The more Washington's campaign faltered, the more desperate its measures became: heavier sanctions, louder rhetoric, and thinly veiled threats of military options. Yet the outcome remained the same: resistance held. This is the paradox that should capture our attention. An empire that cannot achieve victory, but cannot admit defeat, will often lurch toward rash decisions that endanger not only itself but the world. The danger is not confined to Venezuela. When America's credibility suffers in one arena, it seeks to reassert dominance elsewhere. That is why defeats rarely remain isolated events. They ripple outward, shaping policy in unpredictable ways. After the chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan, for example, the U.S. leaned harder on its alliances in Europe, increasing tensions with Russia. In the case of Venezuela, the inability to enforce regime change may encourage Washington to flex its muscles in other parts of the globe, whether in Eastern Europe, the South China Sea, or the Middle East. The hook here is sobering: the more the U.S. loses, the greater the temptation to gamble on bigger, riskier confrontations. This dynamic is not unique to the United States. History gives us countless examples. The British Empire, in its waning days, clung desperately to colonies it could no longer control, engaging in costly and often futile wars. The Soviet Union, facing economic collapse, squandered precious resources in Afghanistan in a desperate attempt to project strength. Declining empires do not gracefully step aside. They overextend, overreact, and in doing so accelerate their own demise. The U.S. in Venezuela fits that pattern: a power so committed to preserving the illusion of dominance that it risks undermining itself further. What makes the situation more dangerous is domestic politics. Leaders facing pressure at home often use foreign policy failures as a justification for escalation. For Trump, Venezuela was meant to be proof of his ability to restore American greatness. Its failure, therefore, was not just an external problem, but a political wound. And political wounds, especially in polarized societies, breed risky behavior. A president who cannot afford to look weak before his base may choose aggression over restraint. A nation that cannot admit decline may chase illusions of victory long after the cost becomes unsustainable. That is why Venezuela matters beyond its borders. It reveals a psychological trap that America's ruling class may not be able to escape. The world is watching this play out, and rivals are taking note. Russia and China see opportunities in U.S. overreach, ready to step in where America stumbles. Smaller nations, meanwhile, are learning a different lesson: resistance is possible. If Venezuela can survive, why not others? Each successful act of defiance raises the stakes, making Washington more anxious to prove that it still commands obedience. This creates a volatile cycle. Defiance breeds overreaction, overreaction breeds further failure, and failure deepens decline. Here is the most haunting hook of all. The true danger of a declining empire is not its weakness, but its refusal to recognize that weakness. The United States, like the great powers before it, may respond to defeats not with humility but with fury, and in that fury lies the risk of conflicts larger, bloodier, and more catastrophic than the ones that revealed its decline in the first place. Venezuela, then, is not merely a story of failed policy. It is a warning sign that the world's most powerful nation, when placed on the defensive, may choose recklessness over reason. The defeat in Venezuela leaves the United States at a decisive moment, a crossroads that will shape its future role in global politics. For decades, Washington operated under the belief that it could dictate outcomes, set the rules, and compel obedience. That belief has been challenged before, but rarely so close to home, and rarely with such visibility. Venezuela's survival against U.S. pressure forces a fundamental question: will America adapt to the realities of a multipolar world, or will it cling to a fading dream of unilateral dominance? The hook is stark. When a superpower reaches a crossroads, the path it chooses does not only define its own fate, it redefines the international order for everyone else. On one side lies the possibility of adjustment, of recognizing that the world no longer revolves around a single hegemon. This would mean accepting that nations have the right to chart their own course, even when that course does not align with Washington's preferences. It would mean building relationships based not on coercion, but on mutual benefit and respect. It would mean embracing a reality in which China, Russia, India, the European Union, and regional blocs in Latin America, Africa, and Asia all play roles in shaping the global order. Such a path is not one of weakness but of pragmatism, acknowledging the limits of power and finding new ways to exert influence through cooperation rather than dominance. Yet here is the critical problem: adjustment requires humility, and humility has never been the strong suit of empires in decline. On the other side lies the path of denial. This is the path of clinging to the illusion that the United States can still impose its will everywhere, even as evidence piles up to the contrary. It is the path of escalating sanctions, threatening interventions, and doubling down on outdated strategies. It is the path of trying to force the world to remain what it once was, even as the ground shifts beneath America's feet. The danger of this path is not only that it fails, but that it fails catastrophically. The more Washington insists on dominance, the more resistance it provokes. The more it resists acknowledging multipolarity, the faster it accelerates the very decline it seeks to avoid. The hook is chilling. The refusal to adapt does not preserve power, it hastens its collapse. What makes the Venezuelan episode so significant is that it symbolizes this very choice. By failing to bring about regime change despite deploying economic, political, and diplomatic pressure, the U.S. has been forced into a moment of truth. Does it continue to pour resources into a losing strategy, or does it recognize the limits of its influence and seek new approaches? For Trump, the answer was denial. He doubled down, portraying failure as strength and pretending setbacks were victories. But for the United States as a whole, the decision cannot be postponed forever. Every year that passes makes the choice clearer, and the cost of avoiding it higher. The crossroads is not simply about foreign policy, it reaches into the core of American identity. For generations, Americans have been told their nation is exceptional, chosen to lead, destined to dominate. Admitting decline challenges that narrative at its foundation. It forces uncomfortable questions about whether the resources poured into global dominance might be better spent at home, about whether maintaining hundreds of bases abroad actually secures freedom, or whether it drains the very society it claims to defend. The choice, then, is not only strategic but cultural. Can America redefine greatness as something other than domination, or will it cling to a myth that no longer matches reality? The world is already moving ahead. Multipolarity is not a future possibility, it is today's reality. China is building economic networks that rival and often surpass those of the United States. Russia, despite its limitations, continues to challenge U.S. influence in key regions. Latin America, Africa, and Asia are experimenting with greater independence, forging ties that bypass Washington. Every failure like Venezuela pushes this process further, making it harder for the U.S. to reclaim its old role. The crossroads, therefore, is not abstract, it is pressing, immediate, and unavoidable. The hook that should keep us awake at night is this: history is filled with empires that reached such crossroads, and most chose the wrong path. Most clung to the illusion of eternal dominance, only to collapse under the weight of their denial. The question now is whether the United States will repeat that pattern or break it. Venezuela's defiance, modest as it may seem in the grand scheme of things, is a flashing signal. It tells us the old order has cracked, that the assumptions of the past no longer apply, and that a new world is taking shape whether Washington accepts it or not. The choice is there, the path is open, but the time to decide is running out.